All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name's Dustin Phillips. John and I were just talking about what I'm called within ISOC-DC. We landed on executive manager, but I don't think that's going to stick. So, um, but yeah, I am doing some of the day-to-day stuff with ISOC-DC to make sure that events like this happen. So thank you for coming again. And at the chapter, we believe in promoting a free and open internet through dialogues that occur at the forum like the Internet Governance Forum. So that's why we host this event, to make sure that we recap and continue the conversations that happen at places like the IGF 2017 in Geneva. And so, yeah, if you want to follow us and make sure that you don't miss any of our upcoming events and programs, make sure that you subscribe to our email list, which you can find at isoc-dc.org. And make sure that you join us this evening after the event for a happy hour at Cuba Libre. You can look it up online, or you can just follow the crowd to get there. A lovely night for a walk. And also, one thing that we do at ISOC-DC is serve as the Secretariat of the IGF USA. And we will be launching that on Wednesday, January 24th, which is this Wednesday. So if you're interested in joining and contributing to another great IGF USA, then please join us there. You can find out information about that at igf-usa.org. And I'd just like to thank everyone for being here, especially our discussion catalysts, Jolly for making the trip down from New York to make sure that the live stream goes off smoothly. And lastly, thank Microsoft for their continued support of ISOC-DC and providing this beautiful space for us to have this discussion. So here you go, Mike.
Thank you very much, Dustin. I've given Dustin the title of EP, Essential Person. He's the one who helps pull this all together along with Ethan Wham. We do about an event every month like this, and then in addition, we usually do a happy hour or a brainstorming breakfast to determine the kind of topics we'd like to discuss. So please do get involved. If email is too 20th century for you, we also use Twitter. So ISOC-DC is a way to keep track of what's going on. As I said, I'm Mike Nelson. I work for Cloudflare on public policy, but in this context, it's also important that I'm on the board of the local chapter of DC ISOC. We organized this event to look at 3 very important international meetings that happened in the last 3 months. The first one was over Thanksgiving in New Delhi. It's called the Global Conference on Cyberspace, the GCCS. I was fortunate enough to go to the one in 2015 in The Hague, and it was an exceptional conference. The one in Delhi was exceptional for other reasons. It brought in a lot of key players from the developing world, and one of the speakers who wasn't able to be here today, Rob Strayer from State Department, was at that meeting. And unfortunately, because the government closed down, we're unable to have Rob speak today, but he wasn't essential employee, so he won't be here. But we do have an abundance of great speakers, both here on stage and in the audience. We also have people who went to Wuzhen, which is a small, actually it's not so small anymore, but it's a town in southern China. It's the Venice of China. It's this beautiful 300-year-old town with canals rather than streets. And for the last 4 years, the Chinese government has convened a very important global meeting there. Bob was there. A couple people in the audience were there as well. And we'll talk about that conference. But most of our discussion will focus on what happened in Geneva just before Christmas. And that was the Internet Governance Forum. Many people in the audience have been to many IGFs. And this is really the premier place where people come together to talk about the future of the internet. And that's why we wanted to have this meeting. So think of this as a meta meeting. This is a meeting about meetings. And I think it's going to be kind of fun to compare and contrast how the people at each of these different meetings were seeing the internet and what they thought was key to the future of this amazing technology. So we're going to do this in a very interactive way. Bob Kahn is going to lead off. As all of you know, he's one of the two fathers of the internet and has been shaping not only the internet technology, but the standards, and really has helped bring together the community that's made the internet possible. He's been a very active participant in the Internet Governance Forum, but he also did spend a couple days in Wuzhen and wanted to share his observations there. After he talks, we'll have a little back and forth about Wuzhen, and then we'll go to our other speakers and we'll have a discussion about all three of the meetings and sort of get a sense of what's coming, what's troubling, and where the opportunities are. So anyway, over to Bob. He's the president, CEO, and chairman of the Corporation for National Research Initiatives, and as I said, one of the people who was there at the beginning.
I think this one will work. Can you hear me in the back okay? So Mike asked me to talk a little bit about the Wuzhen meeting, which I did go to. This is the second time I've been there. I think this was the fourth meeting. And I had been to the very first, I want to say 5 or 6 IGF meetings. I went to all of them up to Nairobi, which I think was 2011. And I give you my impressions about what happened back then, what's happening now, and sort of how that maybe even links to other things. I did not go to the meeting in Delhi, although I've been very interested in that subject for a long time. But I wanted to start out, before I do that, with your permission, to point out that we're in a very interesting time in the history of the internet evolution, as far as I'm concerned, because what started out as something that was sort of wholly grown here in the United States has now become so essential in so many parts of the world that the idea that the U.S. could do something like that again, I think, is very 20th century, to use your term. If we're going to do things on a global scale again, I think we have to be more participatory, because too many people now know what this technology is. Computers are all around the world, and countries that were probably incapable of doing anything material 20, 30, 40 years ago are now able to compete with the best. And so we're seeing a lot of interest in development, not only in China, but in India. I've been to South America. There are some interesting developments there, even maybe Mexico. And so whatever we do in the future, I think is going to have to be done on a more international basis. And that's very hard when you're talking about technology, because, I mean, you can't have an international conference on how to create the internet, because that'll turn into a policy discussion. And so if you leave it only to the technical guys to figure it out, then the policy guys are going to say, hey, wait a minute, you can't do anything without us being involved. And if you go into China, you will realize that there's a lot of oversight and scrutiny of what's going on there. They care a lot about what happens next. And it's just not clear who is essential, who is not essential, who's in charge, who's not in charge. And that's probably true of every major country that you go to around the world. So the history of this is that there are so many misconceptions up front. I mean, I can tell you, even for things like ISOC, I actually signed the incorporation papers for ISOC. We put up the money to create it, but it wasn't obvious to everybody that it was a good idea. There was a tremendous resistance to doing that from the IAB, which later decided to become part of it. When the internet was created originally, this is just by way of background information, the National Academies had set up something called the Computer Science and Technology Board back in like 1986, right after I'd started CNRI. And I was one of the original members of that board, and they were looking for topics. There were like 20 or 30 of us on that original board, a lot of fairly distinguished people. And they were looking for ideas, and I suggested that the Academy look at the role of the internet in society. Seemed like a good thing to do, just plan for the future. And the folks in the Academy basically couldn't operate on it because they were essentially, say, told or determined or came to the conclusion that they couldn't touch the internet because, guess what? It was our or maybe my proprietary technology. I said, you got to be kidding. This is a technology that came from DARPA funding in the public interest. We're trying to get everybody involved. There are no constraints. You can't come to that conclusion logically. But they did, and for 2 years, the Academy wouldn't touch it. And finally, the federal government, the Congress, funded the National Academy to work on that very same problem. And they said, oh, well, I guess it isn't your proprietary technology. I've seen other cases like that before where people kind of get surprised at things. So one of the things that I've been working on for a number of years now is something called digital object architecture. And this has caused a lot of concern in different quarters. And when I tell people I don't understand why there's that concern, they say, well, it's your proprietary technology. And I say, wait a minute. It's just like the internet. It's just a logical extension of the internet. This is not our proprietary technology. This was work that was funded by DARPA, just like the internet. It is something that we are putting out in the public interest, including getting libraries involved and all kinds of other different groups. And oh, by the way, parts of the federal government had a role in causing this to expand around the world. I won't belabor that right now, but it came right from the White House in the Bush administration, and it was sustained for quite a while thereafter. So it's a really interesting idea. I basically think you should take a look at it very carefully because it's got so many attractive features. And what I fear is that other parts of the world are going to see the benefits of it before we do here because there is so much competition going on for who's going to be in charge and who's going to control it. And it shouldn't be that way at all. I mean, I can tell you in the early days of the internet, we tried to get AT&T involved in working with us. AT&T was the 800-pound gorilla in the room, if I can say it that. They were the big established carrier. We had really one of them. And they didn't think this was going to be a business opportunity, in my view. And so they declined, but they were perfectly willing to sell us 50 kilobit lines, which are brand new at the time. So they kind of, had a little business opportunity, and they figured the researchers want to play, let them play. In 1987 or 1988, after the split of the Bell system, there was a meeting in Belcourt. I was the only non-Belcourt person at that meeting. And they had suddenly discovered this thing called the internet. It was kind of like climate change, just sort of seeping up, rising, and they didn't know where it had come from, or at least they said that. They probably did know. They didn't like it one bit, and so they were promoting something called Sonnet ATM, Sonnet being a local muxing system, and ATM, asynchronous transfer mode system. It was a different way of doing packet switching, but one kind of network. And so we had a meeting at Belcourt, the purpose of which was to figure out how to kill the internet. This was not my idea. This was their idea.
Bob, can I bring you back up to the Wuzhen meeting? Because it's the same tension, right? It's between the people who want distributed technology, open and free, and people who want to have some control. I was fortunate enough to be in Wuzhen 2 years ago.
I remember.
And there was really a fascinating interplay between some of the heads of state who were there from certain Central Asian republics who really wanted to kill the internet. The Chinese, who clearly wanted to control it but make lots of money off of it and understood that they needed to let it free so that could happen. And then some of the Americans who, of course, were of the different model. How did things play out this year? Was the same kind of dynamic?
I think the main thing that's different between now and then is that there are more places in the world, technological entities, policy groups, governments that know a lot more about what we're talking about than ever did before and want to have their fingers in the mix. And so it's more complicated. And, if you would ask me, would we have ever been able to create the internet if we had had to deal in this kind of a world in 1972 or whenever, I would say no, never would have happened. And I think the reason it did happen was because a bunch of researchers sort of got let out of the cage, did their own thing, and created this thing that people then said, well, it probably won't lead anywhere, and it kept growing and growing and growing. until here we are today.
Well, that's the key, is that everybody thought it was a $10 million opportunity, not a $10 trillion opportunity, I guess.
Well,
Yeah.
It's the same way blockchain has grown to what it is today.
How many people have been to Wuzhen for one of the 4 meetings? Okay, Patrice? I'm going to turn to Paul and let him share a couple of experiences, because he was there, and you can introduce yourself.
Thanks, Mike. Paul Trailer from Eurasia Group. Yeah, I think Wuzhen has become this sort of this platform which China has been using deftly to get across its vision of the future of internet governance, and I think that's probably a good thing that there is that opportunity. I think the problem is that it's been viewed by a number of Western governments as something they're not at this point willing to participate in fully. I think, though, there are this year in particular, there was a tremendous foreign presence there in terms of U.S. companies and other companies there, and I felt like the dialogue was less political and more focused on the technology. So, for example, the opening speech, which was given by Wang Huning, who's a close advisor to President Xi Jinping, focused surprisingly on data issues and things like cross-border data flows, which I think reflects the fact that the senior leadership in China has realizes that these are important issues. So I think the conferences like this are at a crossroads. I think the next one will be really indicative and important to see how it evolves and who participates in this, and what kind of real dialogue can come out of it. But I think it was a great chance to meet a lot of people and to participate in some very interesting forums that the Chinese side held, particularly on AI and some other key emerging technologies. So it was overall, I felt it was a good experience.
Very good. Bob was telling me ahead of time that in addition to Bob, the other 3 keynote speakers were Jack Ma, Tim Cook from Apple, and the CEO of Cisco. Patrice, do you want to share your thoughts?
Yes, I'm Patrice Lyons. I'm General Counsel to Corporation for National Research Initiatives. And I followed the Internet work going back to Vint and Bob in the early days, and seeing how the digital object architecture has evolved. And that's one thing in Wuzhen. It was looking forward to new kinds of opportunities. And I attended several, for example, you mentioned AI. That was a really interesting exchange. And I'd say a substantial portion of the panelists were from the United States. So from the first time I went in 2015 to now, the mix has changed. And instead of just more static types, it's moving forward to address new topics. Like Bob gave a talk, mentioned about the digital object architecture, and actually how the blockchain are digital objects, and how you can move this to a more complex situation. So yes, I was really impressed, and I was invited to the cybersecurity closed session, and there you had several representatives of U.S. corporations there. Some were looking backwards, and they were talking about how do you define terms, and apparently they've come up real short on how to come to grips with very important issues because they can't agree on the basic concepts. And so Bob, of course, would introduce what we're doing and how that could add to the dialogue. And there was a lot of more people were more receptive to looking at new ways of structuring information and how you include information in a program environment.
Yeah, I think it's also fair to say some were looking for specificity and clarity and detail. And I think it may have been Jim Lewis from CSIS who basically said that the only way you sometimes get closure at these international meetings is by keeping things intentionally fuzzy. Yeah. And so there was this tension back and forth. My sense is that there's a lot of energy going into internet-related things in China. And this is just one example of it. I talked to Gary Shapiro, who runs the CES, and he asked how it was, and I said, a lot of energy over there, and his reaction and the body language was, well, there's a lot of energy over here too, witness CES, and he's right about that. But I think much of that was sort of presentations of what's going on from others around the world, much more than U.S.-centric. This was intended more to be Chinese-centric in some ways, But with so many people coming from around the world, it was more than that.
Yeah.
So I think they have pretensions to make this a sort of like a global conference, and it becomes a focal point for them. But it's so embedded with, not only technology interests, but a lot of political overtones to it. There's very little detailed discussion of real technology there.
Well, I noticed exactly the same thing Patrice noticed when I was years ago, and that the definitions, particularly in translation, aren't very specific. And so people will say information security, and Americans hear cybersecurity. How do we protect computers? Other countries hear, how do we protect ourselves from fake news and American propaganda and BBC? I mean, it really gets confused.
And I'll tell you what's the problem for somebody like myself who doesn't speak Chinese. I know maybe 2 or 3 words, but if you're sitting there, and I sat 2 years ago and I listened to the Xi Jinping's talk, and what I heard was the English translation, which was, as far as I was concerned, almost letter perfect. There was nothing to complain about it, open, transparent, but I have no idea what the Chinese portion of it said. Now, if it was exactly the same, then he got a very bad rap in the U.S.
Yeah.
because he got a lot of negativity. On the other hand, I have no way of knowing one way or another.
Well, Paul and company have been doing a lot of great work translating some of these documents and helping us get a firm. Yep, Patrice.
Clarification. Actually, what I meant, several serious U.S. cyber people there at this closed session, and they're the ones trying to strike the deals that cannot get beyond ambiguity.
Okay, so we're going to wrap up the Wuzhen real quick here. If anybody has any questions about the Wuzhen, Jolly? Oh, just hang on a second.
When I was setting up the live stream, I noticed there was no hashtag for the Wuzhen event.
That's telling, and that's a good reminder that I forgot to announce the hashtag for this event. The hashtag is ISOC Recap. So ISOC Recap, and anybody out there in Webland can pose a question. We have somebody monitoring the stream, and if you do have questions, you can just
Mike,
use
I just
ISOC
wanted
Recap, or you can also, ISOC Recap, and if you want, you can also include the handle for ISOC-DC.
I just wanted to say, this one's probably so good. Even though I was at the Wuzhen conference for the full period of time, in the opening session where I gave one of the 4 non-political keynotes, and the last session that I stayed at, which was this private cybersecurity discussion, I spent very little time at the other meetings there, and I was, sort of given an opportunity to see some other things that were going on. And one of the most amazing things was a visit that we made to a local internet hospital in Wuzhen. And they apparently were set up to take care of people from, I don't know, hundreds of cities, I guess. They had something like 60 or 100 doctors that would take care of them locally, and they'd feed electronically all of the material back in digital form, and they'd get read out, and they'd get experts all together. It was pretty amazing. They had very few patients in this hospital. So maybe it's one of the safer hospitals to be in the world. But I was just very impressed by how they were. Now, we didn't see anybody actually treating patients. So I'm always concerned about whether you're seeing something that's, just for show or is real. But I think this was real, and I think that they have really set a milestone for dealing with remote healthcare.
It wasn't just slideware. When I was there 2 years ago, they had a large conference center with about 150 different booths for all the major American and Chinese companies, but also for universities and other groups that were doing some very exciting things.
This was not a demonstration. This was a real
thing,
place
yeah.
with real rooms, and
Yeah.
they got the tour of the place, so it was
Yeah.
very impressive. And that's what I spent a lot of time doing, is seeing the other things that were going on around there, including a very marvelous show they showed one evening out there. They've got some very amazing artistic things that were, some of them produced probably by the guy who did the Beijing Olympics, which was pretty impressive.
My problem was, as I walked on the floor, every 5 minutes, a Chinese person would stop me and try to get a picture of me because they thought I was Bill Gates.
Oh,
And I'm serious. There's a whole bunch of people at that conference who came home with pictures.
Pictures are very important to them. Extremely.
And I'm from Seattle, and I used to work for Microsoft. Okay, so we're going to change over towards the IGF and compare and contrast with some of the other things going on around the world. We won't spend much time on the global conference on cyberspace. Has anybody been to that one, either the current one? You were there? Okay, so do you want to, did you go to the one in Delhi? Okay, well, I'm sorry, I didn't. You want to give us the 2 minutes you learned and what you saw, and introduce yourself?
Sure. Ryan Johnson with Access Partnership. Yeah, the conference, I think, captured just how pressing, and I think this maybe will lead into the IGF for a second, how pressing the cybersecurity discussion is right now. And I think cyber at the IGF was also, the hot button issue. There were a lot. I'll let everybody else speak to how activity happened there. The difficulty compared to The Hague, which I was also at, is that there was a lot of internal focus on domestic Indian issues that I don't think the Dutch had necessarily left that fingerprint on the thing. So there was a lot of Modi talking to Indians about what India is doing. And I wonder what that does in terms of the momentum and the continued growth of the conference. So I would say that's kind of in the questions to be resolved in the next year and a half as we move to wherever it'll be next. But beyond that, everybody was reeling from the fact that the UNGGE didn't reach its consensus in New York. What happens next in terms of norms and that state-to-state level cyber conflict discussion. And I think we walked away from there with as many questions as we walked in with, but it was good to have sort of an airing of all the positions, and I think that happened.
Well, thank you very much. I didn't know you'd been there. I was a virtual participant. I literally was waking up at 3:30 in the morning and tuning in. The conference in The Hague was actually the best internet-related conference I went to in 2015, bar none. It was exceptionally good, and the videos are still available. The videos from Delhi are available, and if people want to understand what the real debate is, the final ministerial panel is worth watching. You had two mild-mannered ministers, Japan and Finland, up against the minister from India, the deputy minister from Russia, and a very passionate person from Venezuela who wanted to blame everything wrong with Venezuela and the world on the internet and the US. If you only have time to listen to one, listen to the Russian minister who explains in great detail why we need to have a UN treaty on cyberspace and cyber warfare and cybersecurity. You won't like the way he's structured this proposal, but it's really worth listening to because this is the debate. Do we need a top-down system to control the internet, or can we continue to let it go free? Thank you very much. So anyway, there are some great videos and some interesting discussions. And now, for the main part of the event here, which is a discussion with all of you. How many people have went to IGF Geneva? Okay. And again, I was a virtual participant in the middle of the How many people been to IGFs in the past? In Bali and Guadalajara? Okay, good. So, as I said, as informed as our panelists, but they're the ones who are going to get the discussion going. We have two questions that we're going to devote the most of our time to. The first question, which our panelists will answer, is what did you hear that really excited you at IGF Geneva? What was the aha moment? What was something that gave you hope? And then the second question, and then after they talk, you'll talk. And then after that, we ask the more interesting and controversial question, what did you hear that worried you? What is it that we better be watching out for? And we can debate about whether we need to worry or not. That's the fun part. So anyway, let me turn to our panelists. I'm first going to turn to Shane Tews. Shane has about 7 different hats. I think she has even more than I do. Her first hat is as a visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. She also has been the co-chair of the Internet Governance Forum USA for several years. She's also involved in the Congressional Internet Caucus as the vice chair of the Education Foundation that's affiliated with the caucus, and you can explain all the other hats.
All right, that's enough hats for the
Okay,
moment.
so 2 minutes on
One thing I
what,
do want to
what
reiterate.
did you get really excited about?
And as Dustin pointed out, we are having our organizational meeting for IGF USA this Wednesday. So there's information on the web. Grab either Dustin or myself afterwards if you want to have more details. We'd love to have you all engaged either in person or remotely. Going to IGF Geneva, I would say it was very interesting as to which room you went into. People that were from more established groups, and realizing you have academics, civil society, technology groups, business constituency, and users there. The more established groups were still talking about connectivity. And how do we get to that last mile? How do we get to that last person? How do we, manage our resources to get everyone connected? If you went into the youth groups, which quickly became my favorite, and I found myself running into them, is they were talking about collaboration. They were talking at a different level of, to them, the connectivity was given. Let the older people figure that out. They'll get there, right? The youths were not worried about data protection. They wanted transparency. They just wanted to know, what is it you wanted from them? They aren't as concerned about their privacy on all these items. And then they wanted things to be as connected as possible. And they just wanted to know who knew what and what point was their resistance and what could they do to get over that barrier of resistance if they were seeing that in the process of what it is they were trying to accomplish. So it was really interesting that I felt like the younger groups were definitely putting a lot more energy towards wanting to move the next generation of technology forward and weren't having really much concern. They assumed that the rest of this was going to work itself out. So I thought that was a really interesting difference between the two.
Our next discussion catalyst is Gus Rossi. He is the Global Policy Director at Public Knowledge, which has got a global mission to promote the development of the internet.
Yeah.
And you win the prize for best socks.
Thank you. I make the effort. Thanks, Mike. So I was thinking that for me, it was kind of one and the same thing that worried me and gave me some hope. So I wanted to connect them. I was kind of worried that, as you know, the IGF happened in Geneva this time because no one else wanted to host it. So at the last moment, the Swiss government was like, well, we might as well. Let's make it in December at the UN because no one wants to. That's the cheapest way to do it, and that was fine. And we don't have I think we have a host for 2019, which is going to be Germany. It's not clear who's going to be 2018, and that's fine. I think that also says that evidently there is a problem where governments don't want to engage. When governments, if it's going to be a governance forum or one a multi-stakeholder governance, where one of the stakeholders doesn't think that the space is relevant, that can be problematic. I tie that in relation with the fact that in conversations with civil society groups from the global south, but also from Europe and other parts, that they are worried that they feel like the space for meaningful engagement of civil society groups in any kind of like policy debate is shrinking, that there are threats for human rights everywhere, that including the US and Europe. So I think that's not a positive scenario in which when you have also, I don't know if you guys experience, but before going to Geneva, a lot of groups, a lot of people that I work constantly with were saying, well, we might not go because we don't see the value of going to the IGF. And I heard that a lot. So I was kind of worried before going. So I think that's bad news when the most open and multi-stakeholder forum that we have to talk about internet governance at the global level, one of the main stakeholders, which are governments, don't want to participate, and the other stakeholders, which are also important, which are civil society, think that what's the purpose of being there at all? And I tie that with, I think, a trend which is like more borders, less interest in globalization. But that's not going to go away, right? I mean, we're not going to roll back 20, 30 years of history. What I think was a positive note, that's my positive note on Experience IGF, was that I was having conversation with the inherent transnational groups that remain in the world, which are like transnational companies and transnational civil society. And the impression was that there's a willingness to have collaboration between the two groups to try to keep the internet as one and only, to try to keep the internet as borderless as possible, at least in the places where we're used to have the same kind of access to the internet. I think that it's not, we can talk about one internet in Europe, the US, and the Americas, and then another thing that is going on in Asia, and that's especially China and Russia. And I think that's a positive note in in a situation which I think that presents very problematic trends and very worrisome trends, in my opinion, for human rights and for keeping the internet as an open platform.
Okay. Well, thank you. You did the bonus question too. So I know in a lot of the recent IGFs, it really has shifted. The earlier ones were a lot of people from government, a lot of civil society, a lot of technical, a lot of business people, and now it's more like 60 or even 70% civil society. Well, it's more than 50%, I think. I think so. Anyway, it depends on how you count people. Some people have three hats. They're from the civil society, but they are techies, and they used to work for government. But there's it's not an even distribution like it used to be. Okay. Very good. Teresa's next.
Yes.
How many people know what Diplo Foundation is? Those of you not raising your hand have got to go find out what it is. It's an incredibly valuable source of information on internet governance. They're based in Belgrade, in Malta, and around the world.
And in Geneva.
And Geneva. But most important, Teresa is right here in Washington.
And they make great cartoons.
They do great cartoons, that's right. But they also do a monthly webcast on internet developments around the world. And yeah, Jolly does webcasting with them. So anyway, we've done your sales pitch.
Yes.
2 minutes on what excited you.
You've done it. I haven't. Thank you for that. Good afternoon to everybody. To answer your first question, I thought about 2 points that have pleased me. One is on the kind of process of the IGF level, and one is more on the content level. So the IGF has often been criticized for being just a discussion forum, which is also why governments don't want to go there. Because there are kind of no conclusions coming up, and some of you may know that we work mainly with diplomats, and they were always asking, okay, so what are the conclusions? What can we report back to Capitol? And this is always a tricky question to answer because there haven't been many conclusions. And in this respect, there has been a progress at this IGF that you may be aware about the so-called Geneva messages, which were kind of the key outcomes that were coming up from the main sessions and from the high-level sessions, with kind of the key points that the room seemed to agree on. So in my view, this is kind of a clear intent of the IGF, because the Secretariat was really heavily involved in this, on producing more tangible results. And let's hope that future organizers of the IGFs take it up and continue. So that's one thing that has pleased me. On the level of the content that has been discussed at the IGF, some of you may be aware that we report from all sessions. So we have kind of quite a good idea, because of our amazing army of rapporteurs from the IGF, what is discussed, and we also do a lot of kind of analysis of the texts, of the transcripts of the IGFs. And some of the most frequently used words at this IGF, many of them kind of relate to the human values. Mm-hmm. So many words that were used super frequently, and Shane, you've kind of talked about it, words like community, democracy, trust, freedom, maybe also because the youth was kind of so visible here. That's the angle of the discussions that they are bringing in. So this is good news to me. It has particularly resonated in the kind of heavy technology sessions on issues such as artificial intelligence or fake news. Mm-hmm. So that's the good news. That's the 2 minutes from me, I hope.
Okay. So our last speaker is Marilyn Cade. She's been the driving force behind the Internet Governance Forum USA, and she's also been one of the driving forces behind the national and regional IGFs, which we're up to 80, 90 around the world?
We have 71 national IGFs and 17 sub-regional and regionals, and 8 or 9 youth and 10 in formation, which are still forming. And thank you, Mike. I am going to take a little bit of applause for that, because I was a MAG member for 3 years.
MAG?
Sorry.
Multi-Stakeholder Advisory Group. This is the organizing committee for the IGF.
So I was invited to join the Multi-Stakeholder Advisory Committee for 3 years in a row, and I declined because I believe, and I'm looking at Pam and a few other people, Steve and Dustin, John and others here, sometimes we can affect more change from outside than we can from within. And I say that because the national and regional IGFs are, to me, the way that we are going to move beyond conversations at a global level. We can debate policy at a global level. We can only change laws and regulations at a national level. I learned that over many years of being in the role of trying to change laws and to prevent governments over-regulating the internet in the days of the narrowband internet. So I'm just going to comment about something that really I found amazing, and I'm first of all going to be a myth buster, so pardon Gus, but I'm going to contradict something that you said. I think if you don't actually lift the layers, walk around and introduce yourself to people, that you begin to think that the IGF is stagnant. For the first time, and it's not true that Switzerland was the last choice. Switzerland was interested in elevating and debunking the myths that existed in Geneva about the fact that internet governance organizations should be taking over internet governance. And it was purposeful. The thing that was unfortunate was because they were so committed to having extremely high-level participation from the Swiss government that they moved the event so late in the year that it was a barrier to the full engagement they originally wanted to achieve. For the first time, we moved beyond just having UNCTAD and UNESCO and ITU participating. We had over 30 30 IGOs, intergovernmental organizations, participating. We had more open forums from different intergovernmental organizations than had ever happened before. So why does that matter? Because we can't reach every government in the world, but we can educate through interacting with those intergovernmental organizations. That to me was a major plus. I'm also just going to make a comment about when we use the terminology youth, I actually need to distinguish between young entrepreneurs and young people who are between the ages of 25 and 32, 34 who are employed, and youth, because their positions are very, very different. Like Shane, I had the opportunity, I met with the youth NRIs, the national and regional IGFs. There's great enthusiasm on the part of young people who are employed, whether it's in government or it's in an NGO, to trying to launch youth IGFs in their country. And they are very, very different in their interest and focus than the national IGFs, and very worthwhile supporting. So the other comment I want to make is I think we're missing something that I think is putting the IGF at risk. First of all...
Is this the answer to the second question?
Nope.
This isn't what you're worried about?
Nope.
Okay.
I saw new people coming to the IGF and not being coached. And so I saw opportunity that we weren't reaping. Mm-hmm. So one of the things I took away, and I'll come to the challenge later when you ask that question, one of the things I took away was there were lots of new people, but we couldn't identify them and reach out to them, and yet they were there.
Okay, thank you very much. That's 4 very different angles on this. Now it's your chance. If you want to share something you saw at IGF that excited you, make this tweetable. Make this like the Geneva messages. But I'd love to hear if anybody either has something they want to add to the list we've already heard, or if you want to follow up with the speakers or with Bob on something they said. Okay? Okay, and introduce yourself.
Steve Del Bianco. I was surprised to see civil society in such abundance acknowledging the innovations and competition of online platforms that we're bringing to their countries, but complaining that these platforms failed to deliver economic and social justice that they felt they deserved.
Okay, other highlights? Are there good news coming out of Geneva?
Hi, Judith Hellestein, ISOC-DC, also many other hats. Like Mike says, I think there were a couple of good things that came out of it. One of them is I worked with the coalition that Gus and others, and that was spearheaded by Article 19 to bring together a whole bunch of different civil society groups to try to work together and collaborate. And I think that's a great idea, not just at IGF, but like most of the other international conferences that are going on, and to people to meet together and work together. But also other good things is I work with a bunch of people who were doing indigenous community networks in indigenous areas, and then also on accessibility. And I think that's if you're looking at the bad, that something that needs to be changed is the issue that was highlighted there on accessibility, where they're using a platform that makes it very difficult for people with accessibility challenges to participate. And so I was working to help them change that platform and looking at some other platforms that will be more inclusive so that we really could get everyone who was not there in person to participate.
I think that's a really important point. There's a lot of effort going into making remote participation easy, and I found it quite easy not only to listen, but actually to speak to the audience and ask questions. But if you're blind or much more difficult. Okay, do we have a question from Twitter Sphere? Okay, this is our remote moderator, Aaron Walk, who works for Cloudflare.
Yes, remote moderator and member of the youth. So we have a question from Jane Coffin, and she says, how do the IGF, how can we make it more accessible to the youth and bring them into the debates more, which we addressed a little bit. And then there's a second question, I'll just couch them together, which is, can we make day 0 of the IGF into a practical tutorial tech day as well as a policy day?
Okay, for those of you who haven't been to IGF, day 0 is often interesting days. They have half-day and all-day sessions organized by outside groups. It's not technically affiliated with the IGF, but people are there, so they take advantage of the fact to gather some interesting people for very interesting discussions.
The jet lag recovery day.
Right. I've been very involved in GigaNet, which is an academic group of people who study internet governance, and they do a very good day 0 event. So anyway, who wants to take on these two questions?
Can I go to the first question?
Sure, go ahead. Accessibility.
No, the one about how to make the. I think that.
Accessibility for youth.
Yeah,
right.
We're talking about that today in my office tour with Katie Watson, who was also like there as a youth, and she was saying something that I think was really interesting, which was that the way to like incorporate the youth is like to bring them to the other conversations and the grown-ups panels. If you only have conversations, if you segregate them, then the conversation becomes not totally irrelevant, but certainly less impactful because you are not like incorporating those voices. So I think that a way to do it is like try to incorporate those like young voices to any kind of panel, any kind of conversation that we have, and then defining what is the line of like the youth, right? If under 30, under 35 would be great for me, but I think that's also like that's an important part. Otherwise, it's like bringing people, and the positive thing about bringing the youth and having like panels like the youth and the IGF is that they bring different voices, but also if those voices are only talking between them with no experience, with nothing with no background to add, that can become very limiting, both for the outcomes and for the education and like the personal development of the youth involved.
Okay, anybody else want to take on the first question about youth involvement? Okay, Teresa.
Yes, please. The best capacity development happens by immersion. So if we want to really bring capacities of the kind of future leaders in the internet, it happens if you bring them to the meeting and let them experience it. We've been fortunate enough this year to have certain projects that enabled us to bring many people in, be it our rapporteurs, being the remote chairs. And they have loved it, because that's an amazing opportunity which doesn't happen in any course training. So I would just like to appeal to any possible donors that have the resources to really consider giving resources to making the IGF accessible, in the sense of putting aside funds to really bring people to travel around and participate. And super shortly, I was in one session on capacity development, and one question was exactly about this. So what do we do, the young people, when we come to an event? How do we get possibly to the panels? And the moderator of that panel said, okay, that's your opportunity, come and take over. And it was a young guy from Indonesia. It was a kind of brave thing to do, but he really stepped up. He went to the desk, the moderator sat down, and he kind of took over the session. And that's again an immersion, and it worked well.
I was going to say, it's a lot easier to get youth to come to your meeting when it's in Geneva and people can take the train, as opposed to Bali. But for this guy, I guess it would have been easier in Bali. Okay, Marilyn, same question.
Marilyn Cade speaking. So I'm going to just look at Pam and a couple of other people. In the past, IGF USA had a very aggressive, assertive approach to involving youth. We had workshops. They were organized by Pablo Milano and by Demi, and I hope this year we're going to return to that, where youth organize an event, youth organizing for youth, but then they were involved as speakers in the main session and in the workshops. I am going to, though, make a comment about engaging youth around the world. There are 4 models going on right now in the national and regional IGFs. One is funded by an organization. I won't mention their name other than the fact that they're located in Europe and their first letter begins with C. And they're funding youth to focus primarily on cybersecurity. So it's a kind of a top-down, but it is reaching young, employed people. There's another one which is reaching out to young people to bring them to the IGF. But most of the national IGFs are trying to engage at the national level in bringing youth into their NRI. Some do it by having a day before session, and then the youth bring messages into the national event. Most of the models that we're seeing that are evolving are really trying to integrate youth into the national IGF rather than treating them as kind of a separate entity.
Or a subspecies.
Or a subspecies.
Yeah. Okay, can we get back to the audience so we only have about 25 minutes left, and we have the other big. Other people in the audience who have a good news story out of Geneva? Okay, you have a question.
Okay, I wasn't in Geneva. I'm curious about, I'm Troy Edelin. I'm with an NGO called FHI 360. I'm curious, so if you go back, as far as I understand, the modern internet governance system was founded with WSIS Tunis in 2005, right? And so that was divided, that's where... Bob just explained where the internet came from. Well, aside from his mind, but in terms of like the division of labor for discussions and cooperation around hardware, internet protocols, the creation of the IGF, and so on, I wonder if if you observed in Geneva whether or not any newish technologies are challenging the division of labor in the formal internet governance system. So like data sovereignty, IoT, right to be forgotten, the personal ownership over one's data. Do you see that some of these new emerging things are challenging in terms of like who owns an issue amongst the formal institution of the international government? So if you are noticing that, I see Marilyn nodding her head. Which technologies are kind of emerging to be sort of like homeless or contentious? You know, like multiple. IETF is claiming something and W3C is claiming something. You know, like what are the technologies which are proving to be a challenge for an international internet governance system?
Andrew, is this related, or do you want to ask a separate question? Kind of related, yeah. Okay. And do introduce yourself, please.
Andrew Mack, AM Global, veteran of many IGFs, but not this one. So kind of related to the question that Troy asked and the discussion around youth, one of the big challenges I think we face is time, in the sense that a lot of our deliberative structures are, by their nature, slow. And a lot of expectations, whether we're talking from underdeveloped or less developed nations, or we're talking about youth, they have a tendency to want to see progress a little bit faster. And so I'd be very interested for the people who are there to get a sense of do our expectations around time and around how quickly the internet is changing and will change things, do they match up?
So who wants to take on these two mega questions? Marilyn.
So I'm going to respond to and talk to you to further, Troy. I'm going to use the concept of incumbent versus new entrant. So the incumbent in this space, in some cases, is either WIPO or WTO or the International Telecommunications Union. And, you know, they're all trying to advance how they are relevant. They're not alone in this. UNCTAD, others. What we're seeing is the emergence of, as we're moving to digital transformation, and I think that's something that we all need to talk more about as opposed to talking about the internet. I think we need to talk about the fact we are moving into a truly digitized environment where everything is taking advantage of high-speed communications and improved processing, lowered cost, but also accelerating the need for electricity and for digitally competent users. And we're not addressing that. And I think that's, you know, to get to the major challenge that I see, Mike, that to me is the window of opportunity that we need to be grasping. Because these incumbent organizations are also struggling with this challenge. And if the IGF doesn't step up and have better funding and have more engagement, then we're going to see, right now we already have the ITU trying to move into, you know, they're competing with the IETF, they're competing with IEEE, and it's a kind of a gap that I think we need to be thinking about. How do we step up ourselves so that we are fulfilling this and not leaving it as a vacancy?
So to add to
So
that,
okay, I'm going to ask each of you to answer your challenge question next. But Shane, you had
I guess
a key
it's
question?
a little bit of both, because I misunderstood something that somebody said on a prep panel for an internet governance thing we have coming up at the State of the Net on Monday. And it was Sally Shipman, and I thought I heard her say, governments need to stop dating and the process and commit. And I was like, what? And then I realized she didn't say dating, but it was so perfect. I didn't want it to change. I mean, I was like, she said debating, but I was like, you know what? Actually, that has been what they're doing, is this kind of internet governance thing, is they flirt with it, and then when it doesn't work for them, they walk out. And that's been part of our challenge is, you know, the businesses are committed because they want this to work. Civil society wants something from everybody, so they show up in the room. The academics have been studying this for a long time. Government's not so sure they want to hang around. So that is part of our process. In my misunderstanding, I thought she really hit on something, which is the level of commitment that we have from the governments to this process to keep everybody else coming to the room.
I have to be very careful here, but to build on Andrew's point, but the governments don't have a one-night stand. They have a sort of a 3-year stand.
Right.
And then they walk away.
Yeah.
Okay. Teresa, your challenge.
What I didn't like.
What you didn't like. What do we have to be worried about?
Yes, there were things I didn't like, besides the fact that it was 1 week before Christmas. It has been said here, not many governments are represented. In IGF 2016, 20.5%, IGF 2017, 20.3%, so not even an increase, kind of the same. Yes, you said sometimes it's difficult for people like me to identify which group you're from. Are you civil society? Are you tech community? Yeah, but with government, you kind of shouldn't be having
You can tell that, yes.
a trouble. So the fact that the number didn't go any higher can be even more disappointing, because this IGF was happening in Geneva. Yeah. It was happening at a place where, you know, you have many governments represented through permanent missions. Again, the day didn't help. But I would have imagined that also, let's say, from the permanent missions to the UN in Geneva, there would be something that would shake shake up the numbers a little bit. Geneva should also be a smaller challenge, let's say, for people working on digital issues and emissions, and let's say Guadalajara to get to. Yeah,
Yes.
as simple as that.
Hang on a second. We have someone to follow.
Just to follow up on that,
Yeah.
the percentage change is irrelevant. Governments show up than last year because the percentage could have gone down because of the flood of civil society that arrived.
You're right. I don't have the there, but it's a fair point. Yeah, sure. But still, like the distribution of the stakeholder groups. If we have an event that is dominated over 40% by civil society and with very poor kind of distribution in this chart by the private sector, by the tech community, by the media, 0.4%.
Wow.
Media.
Yeah.
Again, you probably would identify as a media if you're media. That is very sad. So my disappointment is that the governments maybe do not see value in attending.
Well, the media all stayed home and watched the webcast, I think. Yeah.
So yeah, what I think we might be seeing is like also in this respect some fight for relevance of the IGF, to make it kind of worth the time.
And there is a fight. I mean, Wuzhen was scheduled 2 weeks
and,
before
with the
for a reason, right? There was a lot of things going on. Okay, Gus.
Yeah, I wanted to flip the order of the questions again. And I wanted to make reference to a positive development I saw this year, not at IGF, but earlier when I went to Brazil to CGI, which is the Brazilian Internet Governance Forum. As you know, the Brazilian government is trying to remove some functions from CGI and move to Anatel, which is a telecom regulator. That relates as well with what you just mentioned about ITU. As civil society, we're trying to organize to be more influential in the multilateral process that is ITU, because we think that whether we like it or not, and we don't like it, it's going to have an impact on internet governance, so rather to be honest. But the thing I like about CGI was that even in a context that is completely against the interests of CGI, civil society groups and the private sector managed to find a partnership to have the same voice of what kind of internet governance they want, and to demand similar things to the Brazilian government. And in some respects, not fully, but to some extent, the Brazilian government, like Temer, rolled back some of the changes that he had in mind for CGI and Anatel, at least in the formal sense. What, again, or connecting it to a negative side, if you connect that with the ITU, what you see is that some telecom agencies are using ITU to demand some of the competences that we would like to have in multi-stakeholder and more open bodies like CGI is or the Internet Governance Forum is. So there is a clear tension that is also playing at the national level. I think in the Brazilian case it was perfectly reflected, and I think as a positive note, it was good to see that there is a model which is like sitting down and facing the problem, which is like things are not going the way we like them. We need to tackle the debate, and we need to have the public conversation, which is what they had in Brazil, and I thought it was super interesting.
Okay, Shane, challenges, worries.
I think that mine is that the governments are not fully committed to this process. We see them delineating, and it's challenging them for people to know should they commit as well.
My observation is also not only is the overall number of government people, it's also not the deputy minister or the minister. It's now somebody who's there, often a very informed person who's devoted 100% of their time to internet policy, but they're not the decision maker.
Well, and understanding that this was never meant to be a forum to have outcomes, that the idea was to raise issues up and then just put them in the area where they should be. IEEE, Internet Architecture Board, IETF, if they're technical, maybe there's another place they needed to go, where there's a group of people that want to keep them internally at IGF, and they're not designed for that.
My experience is often the most useful conversations happen in the hallway.
Always.
And if always.
Right.
But if, you need the right people there.
Just come pay for wherever you're going and then stay in the hallway.
A quick thing, Marilyn?
Yeah, two quick things. One thing that really disappointed me was the very low attendance and buy-in from business. I'm from business. I'm looking at those of you who are from business. I'm looking at you. Look, we need to step up our act here. We need business from financial services, we need business from healthcare, and we need ministers. So, two quick things. Why didn't people from the missions come? I was in Geneva a month before, and I went to 12 of the embassies there. They had to go home for holiday. They had to go home. It's like what part of the Swiss government's outreach missed this since I got it by just going and knocking on doors. Okay, I may be special, but you knock on a door. And they all go, Marilyn, we want to come. 3 senior people from IGOs had to go on forced leave 2 weeks before. They have to do this. So I think I was very disappointed in this. And while I love the Swiss government and they got a lot of new people to come from Geneva, I think one of my takeaways is you gotta focus on the timing when you work with the host government.
Okay, Bob, any comments on the IGF trends that you've seen?
I want to kind of make a few general observations. It was remarked that the IGF really came out of the Tunis agenda in 2005. I was there. In fact, I gave a remark in the opening plenary. This was a time when, if any of you recall, there was a lot of concern about ICANN and the U.S. government's role. And the U.S. got blindsided about a month before that because it was a view from most of the other governments, including the European Union, which I think at that time was chaired by Britain, one of our closest allies, and Japan, that basically said, yeah, they ought to let it go. And the U.S. government's position was very firm, that's not going to happen, period. About 2 weeks after that, I got called to give up a remark in the plenary, and I said, why are they calling me, like, with only a few weeks to go? And after some discussions, I concluded, well, maybe they thought I could kind of make some suggestions that would break this logjam. Well, it turned out they actually buried the hatchet at about 11:15 the night before. Well, I got, well, you may know more detail, but I had prepared a remark. I had to go coordinate it with the relevant folks in the government. And David Gross sent me a note at 11:15 that night, said, we've just buried the hatchet. So maybe he was predicting it, or maybe his own mind had got, whatever it was, I had to rewrite my whole speech between then and the next morning, because everything I was going to suggest is no longer relevant. So one of the outcomes was they would take this ICANN issue off the agenda for the foreseeable future. You can figure out whether that meant 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, whatever. But as a sort of another condition of that, they would agree to have this Internet Governance Forum. I mean, I objected to the term because I didn't think governance, was sort of like international coordination of public policy kinds of issues, was more like what it was about. But so they agreed to do it, provided that there were no decisions made. This was going to be a discussion session only. Now, I've been involved in enough organizational things like that when people come together because there are a lot of swirling issues that they care to talk about, that is motivational for a while. But sooner or later, they say, well, okay, we're recycling. What are the new issues? We're talking about the same old thing, and people tend to peel off at that stage in the game. Now, I want to give a shout out to Marilyn for all the work that she did on, getting these regional and national IGFs, because I can tell you that's one of the hopes that this can have some enlivenment going forward, because you can now have ideas that come up in different quarters that can promulgate it. And one of the things I've been pushing that's got a lot of very bad press for all the wrong reasons was this idea of a digital object architecture, which actually came out of U.S. government funding. And I gave one of the addresses at the African IGF meeting in Durban back in, I think it was like maybe October of 2016, and Chinkatai, who runs these now after Marcus stepped down, basically said, you got to come and talk about this at the IGF meeting. And I said, I'd be delighted to if you can figure out a time. Well, this didn't work because of all of what was going on in Beijing. I couldn't get there. But they actually had it on the agenda for somebody to talk from the Donna Foundation. And I think that was a very positive step, because there's so much misunderstanding and misconception about that clarifying would really be good. And so that's one of the things that I think the IGF has got to be most concerned about. What is the mechanism by which it stays vital? Yeah. And if it's, I mean, you talk about youth, but I think the issue isn't so much youth as new ideas. coming into the mix and ways of talking about it that are productive for everybody concerned.
Yeah, Marilyn will tell you, when we were on the MAG together,
Yeah.
the organizing committee, I was the one who was always saying, but we've got to talk about this thing that none of you have heard about. And because none of them have heard about it, they weren't really willing to listen
Which
to
thing
Mike
are you-
Nelson talk about it.
Which thing were you talking about?
Everything from blockchain to the Internet of Things and the cloud of things, and
Should have been promoting the digital object architecture.
and content distribution networks, the kind of thing Cloudflare does. There's just a lot of tendency to do the safe thing.
I've been giving keynote talks at blockchain conferences, starting with one in Washington almost a year ago, trying to explain to them the context in which this blockchain notion really arose.
Yeah.
And explaining it really is just a specific way of structuring a digital object. If I were from Intel and somebody's saying I have a particular way to structure memory bits in an Intel chip, it doesn't imply that they've invented the memory chip. And
Okay,
so
we've got 9 minutes left, Bob.
Mexico
And I
and
promised the
Australia.
audience a chance to talk about their challenges, their fears, and we see lots of hands up already. So I'll go to you and then you. And please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Kat Duffy. I'm with an NGO called Internews. And, Internews does and has for years brings large numbers of civil society groups, particularly from the Global South, to IGF, to RightsCon, to other leading conferences. And Madeline, I thought your point in particular on businesses was really compelling, because one of the things that I think that we are struggling with is that human rights actors, policy advocates on the ground tend to live in different spaces than technologists. And those technologists may live in different spaces than entrepreneurs. And in so many of these emerging economies, the overwhelming argument in favor of a free-flowing internet is not going to be, for example, free expression. It won't really be based in civil and political rights. It will be based in economic growth, right, and economic drivers. It's one of the best defenses we have against a shutdown in Cameroon, is that, the Silicon Valley of Cameroon is in the Anglophone region that's been blocked. But there are no funding mechanisms to get those emerging nascent entrepreneurs into these spaces. We can find slight funding, really still abysmal funding, to get policy advocates there. But at the moment, what we aren't developing are those really important local ecosystems of connecting technologists and advocates who are looking at these things from multiple lenses. And I think it's also then we're losing a lot of opportunities for effective, not necessarily youth engagement, but new idea engagement in these major venues, because we're missing such a huge swath of the population in the sort of newly connected and increasingly connected world. And so any ideas about how we can start narrating the importance of that or start creating structures for it, I would be fascinated to hear them.
I had one idea that I shared at the final session of the IGF. They had an open mic, and I got my 90 seconds and said, you can't find anybody to host the IGF in 2008. Let cyberspace host it. And it would be very similar to what the Internet Society did with the inner community. They did their annual meeting in 7 hours. They did about 16 meetings around the world, all webcast. And you could imagine just moving the whole thing to cyberspace. The youth could afford to go. The business people would go, ministers would go, but would have to get jolly to run it. As soon as you do that, someone will suggest we run it on the blockchain. I'm ready. Okay. Gus, you had a response to that?
Yeah. So it's interesting your question, because I think that or your comment, because we came to a centralization, and I think that a part of the solution can be to also. I know your experience. In my experience, many groups from civil society from the Global South don't have necessarily a cooperative way of working with business and state actors, right? And many times it's for good reasons. Many times you cannot have that kind of conversation. Oftentimes you can. So I think it's also about how we help groups in other parts and convey the good and the bad parts of the experiences that we have here, for example, in the US or Europe. We, for example, many times, as my boss would like to say, like most of the policy fights we won is because we were in alliance with some business group or others. Other times we don't win those policy battles, right? So, but what we try to do is like when we work with local partners, especially in Latin America, it's like we also tell that part of the story. We also say, oh no, actually we work with this and that group, and yeah, we don't agree on these other 90 issues, But on that one specifically, we did agree, and that helped us change that policy or stop that policy. So I think maybe part of this of the solution, which is very complex and it's not the only part, is like how we convey that message to groups in other parts where there's not the tradition of like working third sector with private sector like we have in the U.S.
Yeah, I think both the global IGF and the regional IGFs are not just about sharing information, they're about finding allies. Marilyn?
So real quickly, name the two global business organizations. One has 35,000 chapters worldwide and the other has 50,000 chapters worldwide that reach small and mid-sized businesses in 35,000 and 50,000 communities around the world. Rotary, oh, you're cheating, I told you. And Lions Club. And so talk to me later because I have just established a dialogue with them about getting them involved at the national and regional IGFs. That is reaching the local community, not just the multinationals.
Yeah, the Chamber of Commerce also has a lot of, and they're already involved, but they're different. They're different. Okay, next question. We have time for a couple of questions.
Hello, name is Gio Bay. I'm a researcher in the area of innovation, also more of from a technological side. I mean, that's my personal perspective, but try to take in a broad perspective of the other viewpoints. I have a particular interest in wanting to know, has there been any specific discussion about metrics? How do you measure? How do you measure cybersecurity? And also, a separate issue, but very much related, cyber privacy. Is there an accepted metric or at least a goal how we can tell, are we improving, are we getting less, or are we staying the same? What metric, objective metric in those areas?
Just let me get the other question and then we'll yeah, and I want to introduce you to two other Internet Society events that we have webcast on that issue. So we had Patrice.
Yes, quickly from a business perspective, trying to get the business community involved, going directly into the muscle, the technology. And for example, Etsy recently had the first, Etsy is the European Standards Group, and it's basically a lot of business groups that are involved for technology, but a lot of U.S. corporations are participating in it. And there was the first FRAN case. You know, that's the, when you have you have the non-discriminatory licensing that a lot of the organizations have adopted. And if you read the decision, there was something like 7,000 separately identifiable patents involved. So if you have any group that gets together to talk about this, and privacy, for example, you definitely have to have the security, but privacy is one type of management. So there are a lot of flavors, and some of them are heavily locked up because people need to do business and they need to make money, a lot of the corporations. So good luck on attracting very large open discussions about technology, because I think you'd run smack up against the world of patents.
Okay, one last check. Aaron, do we have any comments from Twitterland? Okay. So if we can just let each of you go down and
respond to
these
metrics?
questions and also give some final comments if you have other thoughts.
Well, I just want to say something about metrics. I mean, it's hard enough to have metrics about the internet itself rather than specific pieces of it. I started my career out in AT&T working in the part of the company that dealt with metrics for the belt system. It was one of my responsibilities working with a fellow there who probably not known to anybody, but he was really in charge of that. And they set global metrics, and we could figure out how well the system was going in terms of how many markers and senders, what lines were where, and we could sort of implement it that way. The problem with the internet is that there are so many independent pieces that all have to work together that you'd almost have to put criteria on each one of them that would be staggering in order to make the whole thing work. So just like the physicists, the holy grail is to find unified theories of everything. I mean, I think this is one of my holy grails. I'd love to find out a way to figure out how to put a metric on the internet itself. And I keep thinking about that from time to time, but I think it's a stretch.
Yeah, in your day at AT&T, it was more like physics, and you had one network, and you could measure the whole network, and now it's more like ecology and trying to measure
No,
all this different
I don't
ecosystem.
disagree with that.
Okay, Shane?
Just on metrics as well, I think the part of the challenge is we have being a technologist, you want to work in a world that is more finite. And when you're dealing with executives who have to manage this new cybersecurity risk, it's always been there, but they have a much more legal understanding of the challenges they have in front of them. Is what's the floor on this, as well as understanding these numbers are always seem to them astronomical. So you had 80,000, 100,000, issues with X amount of machines, just so they understand that you're always under attack. So part of it, I think that metrics, whoever decides to get there first to something that is palatable and actually measurable, has to understand to put it in a quantifiable number where people they see that you're never going to get to zero. I mean, we're not in an element now where you ever, it's not going to be like, we want a whole day and no one attack the system. So that's part of the challenge, and it's also a little bit like internet governance. You have all these different groups that are trying to participate in this, and they each have a part of the puzzle that you're trying to get to collaborate towards whatever number it is that you want. Is it 100? Is it 1,000? But hopefully they're trying to drive the number down, so we're having less and less incidents.
So Gus, you want to answer the question or give some final comments?
It was interesting because actually I did my PhD. Here comes on. Yeah. I did a PhD on internet privacy, and I spent like a couple of years looking at an index that tells me which country, which jurisdiction has more privacy than the other, and that doesn't exist. And then I started thinking like, why does not exist, right? It doesn't exist mainly because it's about values and culture. So some cultures, some places would like to have would consider some things that should be protected, and other places are going to be more flexible, and then you cannot have a common index. That doesn't mean that you cannot have variables, and I think the same applies for cybersecurity. Some countries are going to be more risk-averse than other countries, and that's going to be fine. We're going to have to live with that. But we are going to have variables, and we should collect those variables, and we should try to use those as proxies to understand what's going on and which things are working and which are not working, and what it means. But in general, I think that we should be worried of trying to quantify things or try to find only quantitative solutions for qualitative problems, like social problems are. So that would be my caveat.
Yeah, I can also add that if you do a search on the term e-readiness, there are a number of groups have done e-readiness surveys of different countries, and Melissa Hathaway, who used to be organizing cybersecurity policy at the White House, has developed a similar country-by-country assessment. So I can talk to you later about some of that. Okay, Teresa.
Mm-hmm. Not on metrics, but on the private sector. While in percentages it was about the same, and actually in absolute numbers, because the participation compared to Guadalajara, something over 2,000, so there hasn't been a significant move in the kind of number of attendees. But at least to me, certainly, the private sector got a lot of visibility. For instance, the sessions that Microsoft organized on the very hot topics on digital Geneva conventions, those were one of the most attended sessions. So it was there, a lot of attention, at least to the private sector. And very last thing, if you allow me, I brought a few final reports that we've written from the IGF based on our reporting, and I left a few copies next to Pavlina back there. So feel free to grab one alongside with digital predictions for 2018 written by our director, Jovan Kurbalia. Feel free to take a copy. If none is left, download online. Sorry about that.
Okay, no, that's great. And I see Marilyn has a handout as well. The last word, Marilyn.
I cooperated with Wisdom Donker, who is a MAG member from Ghana, on a 3-hour session on what are we counting, why are we counting it, and are we counting the right things. And let me give you my card. I think that right now, if I were to ask you, for instance, who in the U.S. government is responsible for the U.S. government achieving and measuring the Sustainable Development Goals, do you know who it is? Took me 8 phone calls to find out. And it's GAO. What? Yeah. So in 1996, Mark Dadd, I worked at AT&T at the time, Mark Dadd, who was the chief economist of AT&T, worked with the chief economist of the Department of Commerce to try to figure out how to measure e-commerce benefits. 2 years of a corporate expensive resource working with the Department of Commerce to figure out we can't just count the widgets and the lines. We got to figure out how to measure what is changing in terms of productivity, et cetera. You'll really, I think, take a look at this. We have the transcript. I'll send it to you. But we got to figure out who's counting. Right now, UNCTAD and ITU are counting the lines, the SIM cards, the smartphones. That's not measuring what we need to measure. So I think this is a topic that we should all be thinking about. What's the change in literacy? What's the change in healthcare? What's the change in improvement in agriculture? So that's one thing. And the other thing is I have a few copies of the preliminary draft of Marilyn Cade's scary travel schedule or the internet governance events you ought to be afraid of.
So thank you very much, Marilyn. This is sort of the secret handbook that all of us use to figure out where to book our hotels. So I want to thank our discussion catalysts. I want to thank Bob Kahn in particular for not only giving us opening remarks, but for being part of the conversation. And most of all, I want to thank all of you for bringing up so many interesting ideas and questions. We will be posting our next event on the ISOC-DC website. You're all invited to go get some fruit and cookies and coffee out in the hallway, or join us at Cuba Libre, which is over on 7th and H. They have a rum bar, and we'll be having a no-host happy hour. Just follow us, as Dustin said. And thank you very much to Microsoft. Thank you to Julie, Dustin, Ethan. I know. And we really appreciate the discussion and all of you being here. Be good. Oh, you don't mind me pointing at your socks?